Up next, Semafor editor-at-large Steve Clemens will facilitate a conversation on industrial policy and American strategy on climate and chips.
Great, I'm back. I want to say hello to our friends on C-SPAN. We're live nationally right now on C-SPAN. I'm Steve Clemens of Semafor. We've been doing this all day. So if we look a little fatigued or rough around the edges, it's because you haven't seen us live for the last 8 hours. But we're going to turn it on right now. We have a... This topic is one of my favorites since I've probably been in college. And when I was in college, I was obsessed with this professor at Berkeley, Laura Tyson. Before she was really famous, she belonged to something called the Berkeley Roundtable on International Economy with another guy I knew, Michael Boris and John Zeisman. I mean, I may be the last person in the world to remember all of you, but I mean, it was a great gathering of people. And they were so unusual because the entire economics profession hated them, pretty much.
Wasn't quite
and it was an interesting moment because they were at a moment where you realize that there are competing theologies in economics about, you know, the sort of neoliberal versus, you know, microeconomic versus those that think you can align national interests or strategic objectives with economic interests. But it was very, very revolutionary, I thought, at the time. And then lo and behold, she becomes National Economic Advisor of President Clinton. And even though I'd never met her, I felt like I got elevated to that, too. I worked in the United States Senate. I met Laura a long time ago. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have Laura Tyson, Dr. Laura Tyson here, former National Economic Advisor to President Clinton here. I got to know her when I worked in the United States Senate for Jeff Bingaman. But also Heather Boushey, who's a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. I referenced Heather earlier, you know, talking to Nouriel Roubini, who also used to be a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he was throwing all sorts of bombs around, so we look forward to the bombs you throw today. And we have Daniel Kim, who's chief economist. He's like the man in the saddle right now, director of strategic planning of the CHIPS program office in the Department of Commerce. And, you know, right now, I think the question that I want to just put forward is when Steve Ratner was here this morning, I didn't get to ask him this, but you know, when Steve Ratner was helping after the 08-09 financial crisis to reorganize essentially the auto industry and our equities in the auto industry, he couldn't, and no one in the White House could say the words industrial policy. Now everybody's running towards it. They want to celebrate. And you are the mavens of industrial policy. Heather is working very much on climate aligning with industry. Dan is now working with, you know, the whole deficit in chips. But let me just start out with you, Dr. Tyson, and I'm going to say Laura. Dr. Tyson, for a moment of respect, Laura, because we're friends. And I also want to thank Laura Tyson for being one of our co-chairs for the Semafor World Economy Summit. We've been dropping your name a lot, too, so thank you. But I want to ask you, Morris Chang, you know, I mentioned earlier, kind of chewed out the U.S. delegation in Taiwan that went with Nancy Pelosi, saying, you guys are jokers on industrial policy, and $50 billion is a toe in the door. But it was broader than that. It wasn't, you know, a cheap shot. It was basically saying industrial policy to succeed, to develop the kind of excellence you have, you know, at TSMC requires an ecosystem. And so my question is, and I want to get to all of you on this, but are we good at industrial policy? I mean, I know theoretically you've written that we should be, but are we?
I think that we have actually been quite good at industrial policy in the United States in a particular way. Through our research and development and our innovation, we have created whole industries. Honestly, if you think about the internet, think about
flat panel display.
If you think about DARPA, think about the internet. If you think about biotechnology, think about NIH. If you think about defense weapons, think about defense. If you think about space, look, the U.S. has had, we choose a technology or we choose an industry that's growing out of a technology and we support that. Primarily we have supported that not through industrial policy, but through support for research and development and support through, I would say, the skilled people power to do it. So one of Morris Chang's biggest criticisms of the US is not that we may not be able to mobilize the amount of capital, but what he would say is that the TSMC capabilities are embedded in the people, And this is not a quick kind of one semester course in engineering to be a semiconductor engineer in that place of production. It's highly skilled, and we would need, and we're going to hear about this. So I think the U.S. is taking, in the CHIPS area, we do need to develop the entire ecosystem. The question is, how much does that cost, and do we have time? Because essentially what we're sort of, if we think it's going to be a domestic reducer, Intel's quite far behind. Do we give it enough time? The other thing is, I think...
And let me just ask you a question. Wasn't Intel stupid?
Intel made a bunch of bad decisions.
I mean,
yes.
I'm sorry, Intel, but I mean, they
decisions.
didn't invest in a technology they invented. I mean, they were ASML, right? Or is that right? ASML. I mean, they were the big drivers of UV lithography.
Bad decisions. They absolutely did. But now, I want to go to industrial policy and focus on this. The goal of industrial policy is domestic capacity in a targeted sector. Domestic capacity doesn't have to mean American-owned capacity. It means domestic capacity. And so if Samsung comes and TSMC comes and we get a number of important players in the global semiconductor supply chain
so they put capacity
to develop capacity here, that is successful industrial policy from my point of view.
So
because
if
the goal
taxpayers pay for SK Group or Samsung to come here and wipe out Intel, that's okay?
If the goal of the policy, as I think it should be, domestic capacity, and the best source of the domestic capacity is a firm that is not owned by Americans, yeah. Okay, I want to define industrial policy with a focus on domestic capacity. That's what I want to do. And if you think about, let me give you another one where you and I had intersections on this. How did we deal with the auto industry when we were really concerned about the Japanese taking it over? We used voluntary export constraints. We said to the Japanese, oh, you want to sell your cars in the United States? Restrain exporting to the United States, and please produce in the United States. And of course, we got BMW, we got Toyota. That unleashed a whole bunch of domestic capacity in the U.S. in the auto industry, not owned by U.S. firms. But the production's in the U.S. and the employment's in the U.S.
Senator Fritz Hollings, the late Senator Fritz Hollings, used to tell me, you know, Steve, you call me a protectionist. He says, darn right I'm a protectionist. Look, I've got a BMW plant here. I've got a, this plant here. His state, South Carolina, was booming at that. But Heather, I'm interested in this broad question of how you get it right and how, as you sit advising the president, one of his chief economic advisors, to align. Yeah, I know you're working on climate, but feel free to talk about any arena of this as you're kind of dealing with, the broad strategic objectives of, American revitalization. I mean, there's enormous change, right? His boss, the Secretary of Commerce, has become like a general in the economy, right?
That she has.
Superpower. And I tried to get Gina Raimon to come over here. I said, look, you're the most powerful person in the economy today, and I think she's ducking it. But but I think the question is, how do you constructively align objectives with industry so that you don't get accused of picking winners and losers?
So these are great questions. I think that I want to start by saying a couple things. And one is that it's called by a lot of different names. We in the White House have been talking about this a lot as an industrial strategy, which I think gets to your point. What is the strategy? What are we trying to accomplish here? And then there's a whole host of different policy tools. But let's focus on the fact that these are strategic decisions that the United States needs to make. And you think about chips, which I'll let Dan talk about, but I want to talk about the clean energy industrial strategy that we've been embarking upon. Nothing could be more urgent than the existential crisis of climate change. And yet, if it were easy to move everybody to clean energy, we would have done it a long time ago. If it was so easy for private capital to do this, it would have happened already. And if it was easy for policymakers to address it, I think without doing this, we would have done it before. But here we are. We need to move. We need to move very quickly. And we need to transition how we power our economy. That's everything, from how we produce energy to how we manufacture all the things that use energy in different ways. So with that kind of a challenge, that is exactly where an industrial strategy can be very useful. This is a national security issue, it's an existential crisis, and we want to make this move to clean energy as swift as possible and work as well as it can as possible for the American people, American consumers, and American workers. So the way that we've thought about it, the way that the president's plans have been executed on, is that we are trying to innovate, we are trying to produce at scale, and we are making sure that we don't leave anyone behind to the best of our ability. So thinking about questions of equity from the get-go, but making sure that the policy is focusing on doing what it can to make sure that those good ideas, where we've focused a lot on R&D, that they get to commercial scale, and that this is a resilient supply chain in clean energy. One of the things we know is that in fossil fuels, OPEC controls over a third, about 40% of the world's oil supply. You add in OPEC Plus, you get a little bit more than that. And yet we know that in core parts of the clean energy supply chain, China has a monopoly, controlling upwards of 90% of some core components. That is not a strategy for a resilient supply chain, and so that's where what we make here in the United States matters, how we make it matters for economic security.
Do you have resilient politics around it? What was the company, Solyndra?
Let's talk about Tesla.
Let's talk about Tesla.
They were financed from the same
exactly
program. Exact same program. One of them skyrockets, and we never talk about it, but he's everywhere. Yep. The other one. So here's the thing. Yep. This is the thing.
I interviewed Elon Musk when he brought his check back and gave it to Stephen Chu for the money that they had returned, so it's a success. So I want to talk about it, but my broad question is, I think a lot of people in the industry would say the Solyndra stuff was a cheap shot criticism, that there were so many other areas. But it does talk about whether what you're doing can be continuous.
Well, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. As I noted, if it were easy for firms to make a ton of money doing this right now with technology that may or may not be at commercial scale, it would be happening. It's not. So a lot of our policies are about creating those demand signals. Consistent, certain, clarity. We want to move to electric vehicles. This is what the U.S. is going to do. We're taking all of our policy tools to push us this way. That is creating a clear demand signal. And there are parts of this broader strategy that are going to invest in things that, to get them from the idea to commercialization. Yeah, that's risky. That's why private capital isn't there. But again, for the health and well-being of us all, for our national security, we need to take some risks. And in fact, if we're not taking those risks, then we're probably not going to spur this clean energy transition as quickly as we need to.
How dependent is our EV industry on China today?
Lots. I have charts on that.
As we whack China on Huawei, is there not a day where they whack us on EVs?
And yet we're also taking clear steps to work around that. So we just, we're partnering with our friends and allies in Europe on a critical minerals agreement, right? We are taking those steps because we can't leave ourselves vulnerable to monopolies of any kind. Right? The president is focused on a whole of government pro-competition agenda. This is part of it.
Dan, Kim, you're known as Mr. Chips, right? And I mean this seriously. I had an opportunity to interview Pat Gelsinger, the current CEO of Intel, who did blame Intel's bad decisions not on policy but on previous CEOs.
He does.
Which raises interesting ethical questions about the money that came in. But I said, basically, how do you get this right? What's our goal? How do you get to parity in the United States with what Taiwan has? And he said, give us 2 years and we'll be there. So will we be at parity with TSMC in 2 years?
I think the key question is, how do we get there? And what kind of ecosystems can we create?
I think it's how to get there and will we get there?
I think what kind of ecosystems can we create in the United States that will enable firms that are capable of producing the most advanced kinds of chips to establish their presence in the United States in a serious way. So we talk about clusters in our Vision for Success paper,
right?
And we have a very clearly articulated goal.
So who's in the cluster?
So there is economies of scale that is involved in chip making. It takes about $20 billion now in CapEx to build a leading edge facility that is capable of producing the most transistor and power performance type of chips that is found in your smartphones right now. Only a handful of companies can do this. Right now, in fact, it's just 2, and they're concentrated in East Asia. But if you think about the geopolitical and economic risks of that concentration, I think it's a very interesting and worthwhile goal that Secretary Raimondo has articulated to make the US a place in which all those companies can set up shop and do their R&D and advanced manufacturing in the United States. It would be the only country where that's the case, right? So you could go to Taiwan, you could go to Korea, you could go to other places, and they can tell you that they're good at very one thing, or some things, but they're dependent on others. I'm not suggesting here that the United States needs to become completely self-reliant on chips. We will import,
Well, let me
we
just
will
say,
export.
is anybody in the room like a super expert on producing microchips?
Somebody been working
Well, let me
for
just tell you, I
TSMC?
don't know if this is true or not, but I happen to know some of Dan's former colleagues, and I took one of them very seriously, who said that in every microchip that's produced, there are 600 different steps to get that outcome of a chip.
Yep.
That if you're going to take a plant from South Korea and you're going to put that plant in the United States, it's measured down to the like the centimeter in terms of the way things work in it, and that the only way they know to train, because our job policies are so restrictive right now, bringing people over, that the human capital part of the equation is very hostile to success on this front. So somehow you have to get people who are going to work in this country trained over in places like Korea that worked in a facility, rebuild that exact same facility over here so they can come. I mean, it's a crazy story. So where is your former colleague wrong?
I don't think that's wrong. I think if you take the most advanced memory chip right now that's in your phone, it's called the DRAM chip.
Yeah.
It's 800 process steps.
800 process steps. And corrected.
And it takes weeks to get through the whole process. If you're able to achieve 99% yield at each of those steps, at the end of the 800 steps, you get 0% yield, right? So the simple math is simple. If you go 0.99, raise it to 800, you get 0%. If you go 99.9%, you still get very low volumes. If you get to 99.999% average at each of those steps, then you start to compete at profitability levels. What that means is this is the type of production that requires perfection.
Yes.
At nanoscales, at nanometers, the transistor length that is now finer than the width of a virus.
So.
We can't observe it anymore by the human eye. So what that means is it's not going to go to places where the labor is cheapest.
So how do you do it? Yeah, so how do you do it?
It's going to go to places where the ecosystem is efficient, where the workforce of highly skilled engineers could do their manufacturing, process engineering, where there is partnership with customers, chip designers, end-use users, and your material suppliers, chemical producers, equipment suppliers, where they could all come together to innovate together. That's what it's going to be.
Can I ask a question, though?
Yeah.
Really, the U.S., and this was a surprise for me. So I was a fan of I am a fan of industrial policy.
You've
early
been,
on,
even when you worked for Bill Clinton.
I made the argument many times that in order to stay at the technological frontier, you had to be in the production space. It turned out that was not true in semiconductors. The U.S. maintained a fairly significant capabilities in the technology, but we actually, for reasons of cost, we just moved the production someplace else. We literally did, because it was too costly
So Qualcomm
to
designed,
run.
Korea built.
Yeah, it was simply too costly. So I want to say, I think we're going to end up building very costly semiconductor fab capabilities in the U.S. because it's costly to do it here. It's costly to do it here. And that's all. I think that I saw an interview, a question to Secretary Raimondo. Listen, if you really need this labor, which Morris Chang and others say, you guys should just have a much better visa policy. And of course, the Congress is not going to go along with that. So the Congress writes the CHIPS Act, but there's no ease for the importation of the kind of labor that already exists and is being trained in Korea or Taiwan to come here. So I think it's going to take us time. All I guess my question in a way is, how do we do that? How do we get those engineers? How do we train them? Where are they? They're going to be costly in the United States. They are going to be costly.
Can I ask you just a very provocative question in addition to Laura's. You know, we had Ambassador Robert O'Neill on before, and it wasn't a dark issue. I mean, Robert was very serious recently when he told me in an interview that if China successfully invaded Taiwan, we would make sure that TSMC is no longer standing. It would be blown to bits. We would destroy it. That's what he said. And so,
Oh, that's interesting. I've heard of
you know,
plans
whether that's
to
true
move
or not, not that that would be a good thing for the United States, but nonetheless, doesn't it make putting those chip facilities in the United States a smarter
Yes.
thing to do right now from a geostrategic, selfish perspective?
So one thing I would correct there is there's no semiconductor fabrication facility in the world that could run independently of American technologies, period.
Yeah, there you go.
They all require American technology
do
in
the
terms
technology.
of EDA software or equipment.
Right?
It is, yes, it is a very spread out supply chain, but at the same time, it's one of the most collaborative supply chains in the world. No one country is self-sufficient in terms of supply chain or technology. And so I'm not going to comment on whether there needs to be some actions taken there, but I would say that it would be foolish to think that one country could be completely self-sufficient in terms of technology, particularly without U.S. technology.
On the climate front, on the environmental front, Heather, you know, when you saw, you know, China's early investment in solar, and they went into solar, they brought in a lot of technology. To some degree, some people would argue they stole IP, you know, did this and whatnot, but then they became global dumpers, some would say, in solar. Why doesn't the United States do that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the challenge, and solar is a great example, because the United States also invested heavily in solar.
Right.
We had an industry, and then...
But why didn't we become the dumpers and take over market share?
So I think that gets to, these are strategic questions that we're making now, and we're saying these are industries where it's important that we have access to them. It's important that we have reliable supply chains. It's also important that we are connecting the dots between our economic policy and what that means for workers and communities in terms of, you know, equity issues. And so I think at this point we're saying we need to make sure that we have the capacity to do that. I think Laura's point, it's not so much about ownership, it's about the United States having the capacity to produce this, having the capacity to produce on the cutting edge of these semiconductors, because we've seen what happens when we don't. And so the last couple of years have been just a case study in how unsettling it is when fragile supply chains are upended. What happens when you can't have access to the semiconductors you need? Well, car prices go up, you know, go sky high. This feeds inflation, which American people don't really care for all that much. So we need to be thinking about the whole cycle here. And I mean, I would argue that it is thinking about that in a smart and strategic way that this administration is getting at each and every day, and thinking about and working on, combined with the need to make sure that we are shaping markets in a way that is pro-competitive.
I mean, let me ask you both here, and I want to finish up with Laura, but I want to ask you, in the worlds in which you work in U.S. government, to the degree you can say this, do you have any, like, true University of Chicago neoliberal economists you have to convince of your views, or like there are little mini Larry Summerses or Bob Rubins that are nipping at your heels, and I say that with affection to Bob Rubin and Larry Summers, but I mean, they have a very different orientation than the two of you do.
But that is true that they do, and there's economists who are trained all over the world in the federal government who are working on these issues. That is certainly, there's not a lack of diversity of opinion. But I think what has been really clear, and again, what the pandemic really showed us, is how vulnerable we are, and that an economy that is not focused on meeting the needs of its people and the strategic places where you need to have access to certain industries, that what we make here in the United States and how we make it under what conditions really truly does matter. We cannot afford to be agnostic about what the composition of our economy is, what the composition of our industries are.
Dan, how about you?
I just want to address one thing that was brought up about costs, if that's okay.
Yeah.
When I mentioned $20 billion, when you're building a fab, about 70% of the costs are in the equipment alone.
The equipment, right.
And those are same wherever you buy them and wherever you place them.
That's right.
And that goes to ASML, right?
It goes to a few American providers. ASML is a Dutch company.
Dutch company.
There's some Japanese providers as well. It
US
is also,
tech, though.
Well, there's a variety of global technology that goes in there. And so I would say that there are ways that we can do to innovate to bring those unit economic costs down. And we're working on that.
I hope so.
The other thing to mention is how do we train these?
Yes.
How do we train the engineers?
How do we do that?
I would say that we already have some of those brightest engineers here in the U.S.
We already have some.
And it's time for us to focus on the next generation, as well as making the U.S. a place where it is the place to go for both R&D and process manufacturing innovation.
That's really important. Process innovation. The U.S. is a place to go. Yeah.
And do you have economists sitting around nipping at your heels?
I'm that economist that's nipping at everybody else.
At their heels. I know my friend Pat Malloy worked in commerce. How many of you else worked at commerce? Very few. Okay, I can get away with this. Pat worked in market access compliance, I know, but do you have a sense that the Department of Commerce at Commerce is saying, wow, we matter now?
I think they've always mattered. And I only joined Commerce just a few months ago.
NIST has always mattered.
Right. Well, let me just finish with Laura Tyson. I do want to end here because, Laura, this is a thing because I do think that the work that you did so many years ago at Bree informs so much of this. You came into the Bill Clinton administration, a lot of this work, but a lot of big choices were being made then. There was sort of, bring China in, PNTR,
yes.
Basically the information technology revolution. You didn't have a lot of things done for workers that were increasingly, I think, left behind by a very turbocharged economy. But you wanted to do that. You had Bob Rubin, you had Bob Reich, you were sort of in between. But I think the question is, did we make mistakes back then, not moving the Bree way as much as you would have liked? And because, aren't we now playing catch up with mistakes that were made 20 years ago?
So I don't think so. I want to say that economists, okay, look, I think that the economists today understand the national security argument for chips, and they understand the fact that by letting the capitalism, so we had this notion of, okay,
right.
we're supporting R&D, we're supporting innovation, we are still, technologically speaking, at the lead of all leading sectors, okay, we are. The production's going someplace else for cost reasons. That makes US companies more competitive. What we did not pay attention to, and we just did not, so much of the discussion these days are how do you share, how do you distribute the income that is generated? And during the period of sort of when we opened markets and we're not paying a lot of attention to that, a lot of the money went to the producers. I mean, if you look at Apple and what Apple built its industry on a supply chain that was China focused. It absolutely did. It made iPhones within the accessibility, affordability for a very large number of Americans, and that would not have been possible had Apple not done that. But the production was not here. The production was not here. For cost reasons, the employment was not here. The income generated for workers was not here. So we now are focused on both.
Right.
We need a sector for strategic reasons, and we need to figure out the employment and distribution of income that comes from that. And that's true for both green and chips. I mean, I think that general.
30 seconds, Heather.
Well, and the reason that they are doing that is because wages are cheaper. So it's not just it's
of course.
It's Apple. So those producers are also not sharing in the gains overseas.
Of course. And I guess they would say, why should they? I mean, you have to tell. The thing is, in the neoliberal capitalism model that we all adopted, and I would say that was the adoption of the starting with the Clinton administration and all the way through, one did not worry about the fact that there were a movement of production and jobs to low-cost locations.
Right.
Because after all, what are firms supposed to do? They're supposed to minimize costs, for God's sakes. That's what they're supposed to do. So a big cost is labor costs, another cost is capital cost. If another country is saying, here, we'll subsidize your capital and we'll offer you low-cost labor, why? It would not be in the fiduciary responsibility of the firm to say no to that. So we're now...
That'll be a topic for a whole nother conference.
What I'm saying is now we're changing. You asked a question. I think the industrial policy of today is actually focused not just on the sector for national security, for green, for climate, but it's also focused on the more equitable distribution
Right.
of the returns.
Well,
Okay,
thank you.
what I would
With that, I mean, I love this, and I could talk for hours on it, but my next favorite panel is next, and these two great ladies are up here that we're going to bring on. But I want to thank so much Dr. Laura Tyson from Berkeley, and our co-chair of this conference. Thank you, Heather Boushey, member of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, Daniel Kim, Chief Economist, Director of Strategic Planning, and CHIPS. Thank you so much. I hope we can come back and do this.
These are good hands.
Yeah, what's that?
And the policy's in good
Yeah,
hands.
great.